All right, folks. So first of all, I'd like to apologize. I'm still a little sick from when I was out on Monday, so I might sound a little bit weird on here, but I'll do my best. So today we are looking at, and we're starting chapter 2, which we're going to be looking at the world's first civilization, which is a civilization called Sumer. Some of you may have heard of it before, but it's not one that you would have talked about a lot in elementary school or anything like that. So looking at the city-states of ancient Sumer. It's chapter 2, section 2 in your textbook. And our focus question really here is, what were the characteristics of the world's first civilization? So what did this civilization look like? So we're looking at that type of thing today. Our lesson objectives, right? First one is to understand how geography influenced the development of civilization in the Fertile Crescent. So we're going to look at the geography a little bit. That's always the first thing we look at when we look at a new civilization. So we're going to look at a map and figure out where this civilization was, and it was located in this place called the Fertile Crescent. We're going to outline the main features of Sumerian civilization. So what was it like? Right? What kind of jobs did they have? What kind of religion did they have? Did they have armies? Did they have cities? What was their civilization like? Then we're going to explain how the advances in learning made by the Sumerians left a lasting legacy for later peoples to build on. So they left a lot of good ideas and good advances in learning that other societies and other civilizations that came after them were able to use and build upon to eventually what we have today. All right, so we'll look at some of those as well. All right, so again, first of all, looking at the geography. So we're going to look at this place called the Fertile Crescent. What is the Fertile Crescent? Where is it? That type of thing. Right, so the Fertile Crescent is this place in the Middle East that's known for its rich soils and golden wheat fields. This was a place where people could farm. So the world's first civilization is going to happen really where the best farming was found in the world, especially in this part of the world. This region became a crossroads, and that's very important because there are a lot of people traveling through this area. It's located in the Middle East. That when we look at a map of the world, the Middle East is in the middle of everything. That's why it's called the Middle East, right? It's in the middle of 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. So anybody that wants to travel through this area has to go through the Fertile Crescent. So it becomes this place that's known as a crossroads. And then within the Fertile Crescent lies a region called Mesopotamia. And Sumer was located in the southeastern part of Mesopotamia. So I'll show you a map here just to show you where all this is and what these things are. Now, Mesopotamia, we're going to talk about, it means the land between 2 rivers. There were 2 major rivers in the Fertile Crescent, one called the Tigris River and one called the Euphrates River. Mesopotamia is all the area that's in between those 2 rivers. That was the richest area of soil, and that's where people were able to settle down and farm and build these big cities and eventually civilizations. So like I said just a second ago, Mesopotamia means between the rivers. Literally, that's what it means, between the rivers, specifically the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, we mentioned this in the last chapter when we talked about why these places why these first civilizations developed in river valleys. It's mostly because they regularly flooded. They damaged farms and settlements and things like that, but whenever they flooded, they left behind that silt that made the soil really fertile. So they had to figure out how to organize these things and control these floods, right? Because they did do some damage, right? Floods damage buildings, they damage cities, they damage crops, they damage all anything that's in their way, right? Water is very destructive, but they were also necessary for fertile soil. So they had to learn how to control it. They couldn't just get rid of the flooding and make sure that the rivers did not flood, but they had to control it in some way so it didn't cause as much damage. So they built things like dikes and dams. They dug irrigation ditches to channel water to the farmland, that type of thing, to make sure that they were controlling the water. So here's an example of an irrigation ditch, right? Building a ditch that would take water from the river, right, and carrying it miles and miles and miles to farmland. Right? You could make your farmland much larger if you were able to do this. You wouldn't have to farm right next to the river. You would be able to take the water out of 20, 30 miles from the river and still be able to farm there as well. So the first, really the features of Sumerian civilization, that's what we're going to look at for the next few minutes here. Now, they built thriving cities, right? They built, because they were able to farm, they were able to turn their towns into cities because more food equals more people, like we said. They did have few natural resources, however, but they learned to make the most of it. There was no wood, really. There are very few forests or anything like that in this part of the Middle East, so they had to be creative, and they built with clay and water to make bricks. Most of the buildings in this civilization would have been made out of clay bricks. Not much wood to go around. Trade brought riches, right? Because they're at a crossroads. A lot of people stop in this area to trade things. That makes them very wealthy and eventually makes them very powerful because of it. People traveled along the rivers. We said the river valleys were great for transportation, so people would travel along these rivers and they would have to go through Sumer. And since there was a big city there, people would often stop there to trade, to stay for the night, that type of thing. And Sumerians may have made the first wheeled vehicle. So it wouldn't have been anything that impressive, but it would have been the first time we would have used a wheel to make a vehicle out of it. So we have the thriving cities, right? And then we have this type of cart that would have been made using the wheel, right? That would have been able to carry things for you rather than you carry it on your back. So they do develop a complex government. They have very strong rulers, right? So in each city-state, the ruler had complete control, right? They were the emperor. They were the king, if you want to call them that. They made every decision. They were the ones who made the decisions for everyone. They listened to other people, right? And other people gave them advice, but they were always the ones who made the calls, made the shots. So the ruler did a bunch of things. He had to maintain the city walls and irrigation systems. That was his job. Right? He didn't have to go out there and dig the ditches and make sure the walls were built correctly and that type of thing. But he was the guy who was in charge, so he had to make sure people were building the city walls, taking care of them. He had to make sure that people were digging the irrigation systems so that water could get to the fields. He would often lead armies into war, and he would actually do that. Right? He would go into war with his people at first. He had to enforce the laws. Right? If he came up with a set of laws that he wanted the people in his city or his civilization to follow, then he had to enforce those. Right? He couldn't let people get away with breaking the rules. He employed scribes to collect taxes and keep records. Right? So one thing we're going to talk about with Sumerian civilization is they developed the first type of writing. Because they developed writing, they're able to do things like collect taxes and keep records of things that have gone on in the city. And he was seen as the chief servant of the god, so he was almost like a god, right? They looked up to this person as being almost, very, very close to being a god, all right, god-like. So a little bit about how they structure their society. Each Sumerian city-state had a distinct social hierarchy or a system of ranking groups of people. Hierarchy is one of our vocab words this week. It's a system of ranking groups of people. So some people were seen as being more important than others, so they were higher up in the hierarchy. And this is based on jobs. So at the very top was the ruling family and the priests. So if you were the ruler or his family members, or you were some of the high priests, because religion was extremely important, you were at the very top of society. Below them were the lesser priests, again because religion is important, the scribes. There were not very many of them. Not many people knew how to read and write. So the scribes were very important in making sure those types of things got done. Wealthy merchants, right, people who traded things and gained a lot of wealth and power from that. And also artisans, people who made the stuff that the merchants would sell. Below them were the peasant farmers or the laborers. They were the ones who were responsible for farming, producing the food for the society. And then at the very bottom, like most of these civilizations, these early civilizations, were slaves, right? And these were people who were taken in warfare or were criminals and that type of thing, or were forced to be slaves. They had no rights. They were laborers, and life would have not been very good for them. It would have been very similar to being a slave in the South before the Civil War. All right, so Sumerians, they practiced religion. As I said, their religion was really important. They were polytheistic, so they believed in many gods. They believed that the gods controlled every aspect of life, so they would control the world. It's like they were up in space looking down on the world and playing a video game, that type of thing. They controlled everything, right? Everything was controlled by the gods. The duty was to keep the gods happy. You had to keep the gods happy. If they were happy, things went well. If they weren't happy, that's when bad things happened to you or your people. Each city built a ziggurat, which is a large stepped temple, very similar to a pyramid. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. They also believed in an afterlife. Now, their afterlife, their idea of an afterlife was this grim underworld. It was not good. Right? There was no heaven or hell. Everybody went to the same place, and it was this place known as the grim underworld. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, right, which if we have not watched in class already, we will watch in class. This is a quote describing the afterlife. It says, it's this place where they live on dust, their food is mud, and they see no light. Right? It does not look like a place that you would want to go. Right? So a major theme in Sumerian myths was always trying, and you'll see this in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is trying to become immortal, right? So that you don't have to die and go to this grim underworld. If you can live forever, then you won't have to go there. So there's an example of the ziggurats, okay, and there's a real one that still exists, right? That the archaeologists have uncovered and dug up. Right? So similar to a pyramid, right? But these were the temples where the priests would practice their ceremonies and rituals. So like I said, one of the probably most important thing that you're going to learn about Sumer is that they were the first group of people to invent writing. So they invented the earliest known writing, and we call their writing cuneiform. Scribes wrote by making wedge-shaped marks on a clay tablet. I'll show you what one of these looks like in a second. You are actually going to make one of these in class. And what they were used for was to record the exchange of goods. They would write down myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh, prayers, laws, and then business contracts. So mostly, though, most cuneiform tablets that archaeologists have found are basically like receipts for transactions that people traded with one another. So like if you went to, say you went to TJ Maxx and bought a t-shirt, right? When you pay for that t-shirt, you would get a receipt back saying that you paid this amount of money for this t-shirt, and that way you have a record of that transaction. Most of the cuneiform tablets that archaeologists have found have been basically receipts, right? Transactions that occurred between people who were trading things with one another. Scribes went to school to learn to write, right? You had to learn to do this. Not many people had the opportunity to do this, and if you were a scribe, you had a pretty good job and you had a pretty good life for you and your family. So there's an example of cuneiform tablet. Like I said, you guys are going to make these in class. You're going to make up your own symbols and do that in class. All right, so lastly, we're going to explain how the advances in learning made by the Sumerians left a lasting legacy for later people to build on. So this is just going to be a list of things that they came up with that other people used and we still use today in some ways. So first of all, the most important is cuneiform. They were the first people to invent writing. Our writing is way different than the writing that they came up with, but we used the idea of writing and changed it to make it better for our uses and our purposes, and we built upon it. They developed astronomy. They came up with a number system based on the number 6. So things like the 60-minute hour come from the cuneiform mathematics system, or from the Sumerian mathematics system. The circle has 360 degrees. That's based on the number 6, and that again comes from the Sumerian mathematical system. All right, so mathematical knowledge helped Babylonians develop basic algebra, geometry, and calendar. So the Sumerians did not come up with algebra and geometry or calendars, but because of their mathematical system that they did come up with, later societies like the Babylonians were able to use that to come up with these things as well. And then lastly is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And like I said, we are going to watch and talk about what goes on in the Epic of Gilgamesh. If we have it, we might have already in class. If we haven't, then we will. It's just a myth about one of the mythical rulers of Sumer. So again, you have the 60-minute hour, right, and 360 degrees in a circle. Those are like two of the big mathematical things that come from Sumer. All right, so that is it for this vodcast for Chapter 1, Section 1. See you guys in class. Bye.